Thank you for joining us today. This educational module will provide you with an overview of MasterCard's Questionable Merchant Audit Program, otherwise known as QMAP. We will take you through the components of QMAP, walk you through a couple of case studies to demonstrate key aspects of the program, and conclude with some questions and answers. The Questionable Merchant Audit Program establishes minimum standards of acceptable merchant behavior and investigates whether a merchant may be engaged in collusion or fraudulent activity. QMAP replaces and expands upon the Cardholder Merchant Collusion Program, or CMC, which focused solely on fraud conducted on bust-out accounts. QMAP addresses fraudulent merchant activity which may or may not involve bust-out accounts. The definition of a bust-out account will be explained momentarily. QMAP also provides a means for issuers to seek partial recovery of fraud losses resulting from questionable merchant activity, to balance the responsibility and apportionment of fraud losses between issuers and acquirers. There are two types of merchant fraud schemes that fall under QMAP: the bust-out scheme and the non-bust-out scheme. The bust-out scheme involves a cardholder and merchant colluding to conduct fraudulent transactions. The cardholder typically will obtain a valid account through the use of a false identity or other deceptive means. Soon after opening the account, the cardholder often will request that the credit limit be increased and may also make frequent balance queries or open-to-buy queries. The cardholder then will use the card up to and even over its full credit limit with no intention of paying the balance, thus busting out the account. The merchant processes the fraudulent transactions, pays a percentage of the funds received from the sales to the bust-out cardholder, and retains the remaining balance. The non-bust-out scheme involves a merchant intentionally conducting fraud, but not in collusion with a cardholder. Instead, the merchant processes transactions typically using stolen or counterfeit cards. Often the merchant does not have a legitimate business and is set up specifically to perpetrate fraud. Most of the transactions submitted by the merchant are later disputed and reported as fraudulent by the cardholders. However, as these are usually card-present transactions for which electronic authorizations were provided, chargebacks are often unsuccessful for issuers. The following conversation illustrates a questionable merchant engaging in a non-bust-out fraud scheme. A fraudster manages to get approval for a merchant account under MCC code 7011, lodging hotels. However, he has no intention of actually operating a hotel.
Hello, this is ABC Bank. How may I help you?
Hi, I'm opening a new hotel and I would like to accept card payments. How do I get started?
I would be happy to assist you with that. I'm going to send you an email that will include an application and a list of all the documents we will need. Once we receive the required documents from your end and review your application, we can have a POS terminal shipped out to you in no time.
Thank you so much. Here's my fake ID, falsified bank statements, some photographs of my beautiful non-existent 10-story hotel, documentation in support of my excellent credit score, and my brother Johnny's number. My best supplier's contact information. Maybe I should go post some glowing recommendations about my hotel on a few internet blogs too, in case anyone wants to check it out.
The sales agent from the acquiring bank receives this business owner's documentation, gives it a cursory review, basically checks that the required documents have been received, and moves the application along without waiting for confirmation of a site inspection. A site inspection, or even an online map search, would have shown a residential area with no commercial property evident. An internet search for the hotel would have yielded the blog comments, but no hotel website or ability to actually book a reservation. The fraudster is approved to accept payments, and a terminal is shipped to him.
Wow, I can't believe how fast this terminal was delivered. Looks like it's time to start booking some rooms. Now where do I put those counterfeit cards?
The program utilizes two separate sets of criteria, which assist in determining if a questionable merchant was involved in either a bust-out scheme or a non-bust-out scheme. Both sets of criteria consider transactional activity that occurred within a 180-day case scope period, which is defined as the 180 calendar days preceding the date on which MasterCard initiates an investigation. MasterCard rules deem a merchant to be a questionable merchant participating in a bust-out fraud scheme if the merchant meets all three of the following conditions during the case scope period: at least $50,000 in transaction volume, at least 5 transactions submitted to one or more acquirers, and at least 50% of the total transaction volume resulted from the use of bust-out accounts. So, how do you identify a bust-out account? MasterCard maintains a specific set of conditions, all of which must be met in order to identify a card account as a bust-out account. The conditions displayed can also be found in the Questionable Merchant Audit Program chapter of the MasterCard Security Rules and Procedures Manual. A second set of QMAP criteria is used to identify a questionable merchant that participated in a non-bust-out fraud scheme. MasterCard rules deem a merchant to be a questionable merchant participating in a non-bust-out fraud scheme if the merchant meets all three of the following conditions during the case scope period: at least $50,000 in transaction volume, at least 5 transactions submitted to one or more acquirers, and at least 3 of the following 4 conditions are true. 1. A fraud-to-sales ratio of 70% or greater. 2. At least 20% of all transactions submitted for authorization were declined by or referred to the issuer. 3. The merchant has been submitting MasterCard transactions for fewer than 6 months. Or 4. The total number or total dollar amount of fraudulent transactions, authorization declines, and issuer referrals is greater than the total number or total dollar amount of approved transactions. Or in other words, there were more bad than good transactions submitted for authorization. Now that we have defined the QMAP criteria for both bust-out and non-bust-out fraud schemes, see if you can determine which scheme might pertain to the following scenarios. An analyst from GHI Bank is reviewing transactional data. According to the data, 2 cards linked to the same account were used in transactions in excess of the account's credit limit, which had been recently increased to $100,000. The account is seriously past due, and attempts by the bank to contact the authorized cardholders have been unsuccessful. 5 transactions have been processed, totaling $105,000, all occurring on the same day within a few minutes of each other and after normal business hours. Prior to this, only a few transactions had been processed on these accounts for minimal dollar amounts. There has been no history of any disputes or fraud reported on the account. If you guessed this was a bust-out case, you are correct. An analyst from ABC Bank is reviewing transactional data. According to the case file, over a 3-day period, a merchant made 42 authorization attempts spread out over 7 different card accounts. The volume total was $92,000. On day 1, the merchant submitted 33 authorization attempts during a 45-minute period, with transaction amounts increasing after each attempt. On the 3rd day, the merchant submitted 8 authorization attempts during a 6-minute period. When billed, all 7 cardholders reached out to the bank, stating that they did not authorize the transactions posted on their accounts for this merchant. The bank's fraud department attempted to recoup the funds through the chargeback process, but was unsuccessful since these all were card-present transactions for which an electronic authorization had been sent by the issuer. This left the issuing bank with little option but to write off the debt. If you guessed this was a non-bust-out case, you are correct. Both analysts suspect that the merchants were involved in a fraudulent scheme and remember having been able to partially recover fraud losses through the MasterCard Questionable Merchant Audit Program in the past. They both begin to draft an email to QMAP@mastercard.com, providing the following data elements required to report a merchant: issuer name and ICA, acquirer name and ICA, merchant name and address, city, state or province and country, total number of transactions conducted at the merchant by the issuer's cardholders, total dollar volume of issuer losses at the merchant, if applicable, percentage of transactions attributed to cardholder bust-out accounts, details of each issuer-confirmed fraudulent transaction, including the cardholder account number, transaction data and time, and the transaction amount in US dollars. Now we will walk you through the 5 stages of the QMAP audit process. MasterCard may initiate a QMAP audit of a merchant based on the information from a number of different sources, including issuers, acquirers, or MasterCard's own analysis of transactional data. Step 1. Upon determining that a merchant has met the initial criteria, MasterCard may initiate a QMAP audit and notify all affected issuers as well as the acquirer. MasterCard will also identify the merchant being audited in the Member Alert to Control High Risk merchants, or MATCH system, using Match Reason Code 00, questionable merchant under investigation. Step 2. Upon receiving notification of the audit, an issuer will have 60 days to confirm that all fraudulent transactions conducted at the merchant during the case scope period have been reported to MasterCard's system to avoid fraud effectively, otherwise known as SAFE. Acquirers will be asked to complete a checklist, providing background information about the merchant and advising of any funds that have been previously reimbursed to issuers. Step 3. After conducting a thorough review of available information, MasterCard will determine if a merchant meets the QMAP criteria and is therefore a questionable merchant. If the merchant is not deemed to be a questionable merchant, the audit will be closed and a notification will be sent to affected issuers and acquirers. If MasterCard determines that the merchant is a questionable merchant, MasterCard will 1. Notify the merchant's acquirer, allowing the acquirer 15 days to respond to the preliminary findings. 2. Identify the questionable merchant in a global security bulletin for 12 consecutive months and provide chargeback rights to issuers for subsequent fraudulent transactions. And 3. Modify the merchant's match record to reflect a reason code change from 00 to 20, MasterCard Questionable Merchant Audit Program. If the acquirer terminates the merchant agreement as a result of the questionable merchant determination, the acquirer is also obligated to report the merchant to Match via reason code 08, MasterCard Questionable Merchant Audit Program. Step 4. Affected issuers are eligible to receive up to 50% of actual fraud losses, as reported to SAFE, resulting from transactions conducted at the questionable merchant during the case scope period. Any funds previously recovered through any other means, such as credits, chargebacks, or compliance rulings, are not eligible for QMAP recovery. For this reason, it is important that any funds previously reimbursed to issuers be documented on the acquirer's checklist and communicated to MasterCard. Step 5. If an acquirer continues to process transactions for a merchant after MasterCard declares the merchant a questionable merchant, the acquirer will be responsible for all chargebacks submitted under Message Reason Code 4849, Questionable Merchant Activity, for a period of at least 1 year following the publication of the Global Security Bulletin initially listing the questionable merchant. Let's go back to our scenarios and see what happened. Based on the information submitted to QMAP@mastercard.com by the 2 analysts, MasterCard initiates audits for both merchants. After analyzing authorization, clearing, fraud, and chargeback data, and reviewing information provided by both the issuers and acquirers, MasterCard determines that both merchants meet the criteria to be deemed a questionable merchant. Upon further review, it is learned that the merchant involved in the bust-out scheme submitted 10 transactions, totaling $150,000 in transaction volume during the case scope period, and 70% of the merchant's transaction volume was processed on bust-out accounts. For the merchant involved in the non-bust-out scheme, it is learned that 120 transactions were submitted through cards issued by 12 U.S. issuers, totaling $320,000. The merchant was located in China and had a merchant category code of 5193, florist supplies. In addition, the merchant's fraud-to-sales ratio was 95%, and 66% of the transactions submitted for authorization were declined. Over the 7 days that the merchant processed MasterCard transactions, the volume of transactions submitted for authorization was relatively low during the first 3 days, but then spiked on the 4th day and remained high for the remaining days. The acquirers are debited for an amount equal to 50% of the actual fraud losses related to the merchants as reported to SAFE, and these funds are then paid out as partial fraud recovery to the affected issuers. As a quick recap, please answer the following 4 questions based on the information that has been provided in this module. Thank you for your time and attention today. Congratulations on completing this educational module.